Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video to Sabaton history. And keeping with what I've been doing with the Sabaton history videos, I want to watch one that goes along with the music video that we've already watched, which is Screaming Eagles. It's the story of the 101st Airborne Division during the siege of Bastogne in late 1944, early 1945. So we're going to get into this today. Not going to talk a whole lot up front about it. Just a reminder, please, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. I'm going to be getting back out there and doing some on-location videos in the coming weeks. I'm heading up to Lakeview Cemetery in Cleveland this week to visit some of the historical graves there. People like Elliot Ness, President James Garfield, John D. Rockefeller, Ray Chapman, who was killed during a baseball game playing for the Cleveland Indians. Those are just four of the many historic graves that are in that cemetery. And then hopefully as COVID starts to clear up, we'll be able to do more and more of this. And the big idea being that this spring, my family and I are hoping to take a trip to the UK, and there'll be lots of videos coming to you from that. So please subscribe, please hit that like button, and leave a comment when the video is over. Let's dive into Sabaton history, Screaming Eagles.
I'm Freddie Mercury.
And this is Sabaton history. Screaming Eagles. You know, eagles don't actually scream. It's more like a ah, ah.
He's not wrong.
Song, Screaming Eagles is about the 101st Airborne at the Battle of the Bulge.
I am aware that people call them the 101st, but in terms of flow for an oral narrative, I'm going to call them the 101st, just so I can tell the story more smoothly. Spirits were high among the common German soldiers as they passed lines of tanks, shells, and ammunition on their way to the front lines in France and Belgium in the early December days of 1944. It had been a disastrous year for the Wehrmacht, suffering defeat after defeat on all fronts. But suddenly, there was this big army assembling in the West, ready to go on the offensive once again, with no lesser aim but to tear apart the Allied coalition in the West in one decisive thrust. It felt like 1940 all over again. However, this was not the German army that had been sent on the offensive in Poland, France, or Russia 4 or 5 years before.
So let's talk about this for a second, because you have to admit that for the Allies, this was an intelligence failure. They largely had air superiority at this time. They should have been aware of what was happening on the ground, that this force was gathering, that they were concentrating troops for an offensive. But by and large, the Allies were caught by surprise by this, and a lot of troops were on leave. A lot of things were happening. Their guard was kind of let down. You know, troops were getting ready to celebrate Christmas, and a lot of folks had gone back to England or to Paris and things like that. They just really were not prepared for what was happening.
By the early winter of 1944, Germany's military consisted partly of battle-hardened veterans, and partly of young boys and old men that had been pressed into the now struggling war machine. The Reich was scraping the bottom of the barrel in terms of conscription and logistics. Supply had always been a weakness of the German army, but in 1944, it clearly, seriously lacked adequate motorization, fuel, and ammunition to support an endeavor like this new Western one. The armored wedge of the offensive was an amalgamation of different models, as was the artillery. Some Panthers and Jagdpanzer, but mostly Panzer IVs and modified half-tracks. But the Panzer Grenadiers rode on the tanks. The paratroopers were reinforced by young men from the Luftwaffe personnel, and the Volksgrenadiers were made of shattered divisions. So despite the impressive numbers, the army seemed to lack the capability of fulfilling Adolf Hitler's vision for destroying his enemies.
So he makes a really important point there, that brute force and sheer numbers aren't enough. That especially in this time in history where you've got combined arms and you've got multiple things happening, you've got artillery and you've got paratroopers and you've got different kinds of specialists, and you've got air power and mechanization and motorization and tanks and all this sort of thing. Kind of just throwing a hodgepodge together of a bunch of different things and expecting them to coordinate and work well together is a lot to ask for the German army at this point in the war. And that was a big difference between the Allies and the Germans, is the ability to coordinate, just the use of how they fought this battle, if you understand what I mean.
As the attack finally began on December 16th, it did fail to achieve its objectives rather quickly. The 6th Panzer Army which was supposed to lead the main attack, had been held up by stubborn American resistance at Saint-Vit, Malmedy, and Elsenborn Ridge. Even though the
And Malmedy, if you're aware of the Battle of the Bulge, that's where an important part of the story takes place. Because Malmedy, there was what was called the Malmedy Massacre, which was a place where, I don't remember the exact number. I want to say it was close to 100 or so American troops were captured by the Germans and they were shot. And before I get on my high horse and say, well, the Americans would never do anything like that, the Americans had done that at Normandy and other places. And in response to what happened at Malmedy, they did it several more times. In fact, the 11th Armored Division, which my great uncle was a part of, had actually done something similar in the aftermath of Malmedy. And George Patton was aware of it. And he actually wrote about it in his diary. And he kind of tried to cover it up the best he could. So, it's one of those situations where there were war crimes committed on both sides, but to the victor go the spoils, so to speak.
The main thrust had failed, though. The supporting 5th Panzer Army had managed to achieve considerable success further south, as it had found a weak spot in the American lines in the Ardennes. Plans shifted on the spot. 5th Army would advance all the way to the River Meuse, taking the town of Bastogne in the process. Bastogne was not only a major traffic hub, but also a depot for Allied fuel, storing nearly 3 million gallons. A precious resource to the Germans if captured, sure, but even if destroyed, it would sabotage plans for an American offensive in the coming spring.
Yeah, let's talk about this too, because fuel was such a huge deal, not only for the Germans. I mean, it was one of the reasons why they were trying to go for the fuel depots in the Caucasus, the oil fields, when they were invading the Soviet Union. But fuel was a major deal for the Allies as well. Patton, after the breakout from Normandy, had made considerable advances toward Germany, but had to be stopped because there wasn't enough fuel to continue giving his armored divisions what they needed and fuel Montgomery, for example. And so they had to divert resources, and it had to kind of stop Patton. In fact, they talk about that in the Patton movie. That's a big deal that happens there. When they first landed at Normandy, the Allies had actually run these pipelines through the English Channel, like underwater and up to pump gasoline from England over to France. And so this was a big deal if they could nab these 3 million gallons, or like he said, even destroy them, but especially for the Germans to be able to capture those.
If Bastogne were taken quickly, there might still be a chance to further advance beyond the Meuse and towards Namur. Before the offensive, the area around Bastogne was considered a pretty quiet sector of the front by American High Command. It lay in between the operational sector of the 1st Army, which had been slogging through the Hütgen forest, and the 3rd Army south of Luxembourg, which was grinding against the German fortifications of the Siegfried Line. So the Ardennes had been seen as a resting zone for battered divisions, or a training ground for green units who needed to gain some experience from the small skirmishes that did take place there. To attack Bastogne, though, the Germans would have to send a large armored force through the thickly wooded Ardennes, with only a few roads available. Such a maneuver was considered extremely unlikely by the Allies, especially in the winter. I mean, a surprise attack through the Ardennes?
Yeah, it's not like they had already gone through that once. The French thought the exact same thing in 1940 about the Ardennes forest.
Who could have predicted that? Sure, that was exactly what the Germans did in 1940, but not again, right? So, the Ardennes sector was only thinly held by 3 American divisions when the armored spearhead of the Germans appeared on the scene. Overrunning American lines, elements of the 5th Panzer Army then rushed in to exploit the break in those lines. They knew they had only a small window of time of maybe 4 or 5 days until the Allies would send in reinforcements. The Americans in the Ardennes had no hope of halting the German advance, but could at least try to blunt the spearhead and deprive the Germans of precious time. So in a fighting retreat, they delayed the Germans with anti-tank guns and bazookas, causing traffic jams by taking out the lead tanks on the narrow forest roads. Lieutenant General Omar Bradley, in overall command of the sector, had been promised big reinforcements, but they would take time. The only immediately available forces in the vicinity were the 82nd and the 101st Airborne Divisions, currently being refitted at Rheims after their costly attacks during Operation Market Garden.
And they were in at this point, kind of not expecting to be in combat. They didn't have winter clothing. They didn't have adequate supplies. The commanding general of the 101st Airborne Division was out of the country at the time. And so they were actually commanded by Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, who I believe was the artillery commander for the division. And so they go in without their commanding officer at that point, General Taylor. And they were actually preparing for a big divisional football game that was going to be happening between various regiments. And the last thing on their minds was going into combat.
While the 82nd was sent north towards Saint-Vite, the 101st, Screaming Eagles, were rushed towards Bastogne. The 101st was an experienced and battle-proven unit, but it did not have adequate winter equipment and not really enough heavy weapons available either. Anyhow, after 2 days of fighting the German advance in the Ardennes, the American retreat had become total, and the troops flooded back towards Bastogne, away from the German panzers. The roads to Bastogne were open, but the weather worsened. This was bad for the Americans, as rain and fog grounded the American Air Force. But at Bastogne, the men prepared their defenses. Field artillery and M7 self-propelled howitzers dug in on a semicircular perimeter, while engineers turned the town into a fortress. On the 19th, panzers appeared on the outskirts of town, and those American tanks that were available rode out to meet them, delaying the German advance once again. That night, the Screaming Eagles finally arrived in Bastogne. So too did the elite German Panzer Division. The next day, the Screaming Eagles were smack in the center of the action. While the German tanks and tank destroyers attacked and destroyed the retreating or bogged down American army units just outside Bastogne, the 101st engaged the German infantry.
Yeah, so one of the things that's interesting about this is that unlike their other operations, Normandy and Market Garden, where they had jumped in, from planes, which is what they were trained to do, this time they were trucked in, and so they called it a tailgate jump when they arrived in Bastogne. So yeah, they arrive in the middle of the night and almost immediately end up getting surrounded. And a lot of people would have said, "Oh man, that's brutal to be surrounded in the middle of the winter with not enough stuff." But for the Airborne, that's what they were used to. That's what they were supposed to do. There's a quote in the series Band of Brothers where they're told as they're entering Bastogne, "Looks like you're going to be surrounded," and the response is, "We're paratroopers, Lieutenant. We're supposed to be surrounded."
Supported by field artillery, the Screaming Eagles fought through the outskirts and local villages and even barricaded themselves inside an old chateau, shooting down the Panzer Grenadiers who tried to flush them out. This stiff resistance cost the Germans even more time, and it was not until the 22nd that Bastogne was finally surrounded. Hitler gave the order, Bastogne must be taken at all cost. On that day, 2 blindfolded officers of the Panzer Lehr approached the headquarters of General McAuliffe, in overall command of the various troops trapped inside the city. The 2 officers asked the Americans to surrender. Confronted by the offer, McAuliffe blurted out laughing, "Nuts!" Bastogne was encircled, true. But for days now, the Germans had tried unsuccessfully to break in and had been repelled time and again. And let's face it, being encircled was basically part of the job description of the 101st Airborne. Lost for adequate words, McAuliffe also just typed out "nuts" on the document. To the puzzled Germans who asked, what was this supposed to mean? The Americans simply explained that they should go to hell and that every German trying to get into the town was about to be killed. So the German forces built up again, reinforced by more veteran Panzer Grenadiers from Italy and more tanks and tank destroyers. But the skies cleared, and the American Air Force was able to resupply the encircled city. The 101st had dug in on Christmas Day in the woods northeast of the city. Digging into the frozen ground in the woods was difficult, but every foxhole was a lifesaver as the German shells dropped all around them.
And I mentioned this watching the music video, but keep in mind that not only did the Americans not have enough winter clothing, so they weren't prepared for that. It was super cold. They also couldn't light fires because a fire attracted enemy fire because then they could see your position. And so they didn't have any heat at all. I mean, just imagine these brutal conditions. It's not enough that you're surrounded and that for a couple of days at least there's no ability for air support because of the weather being overcast, but you're cold, you're frozen solid, you can't cook your food, you can't warm yourself, you're getting frostbite. I mean, it was absolutely brutal conditions.
In the freezing cold, the German grenadiers infiltrating the woods in white camouflage were met with rifle and machine gun fire, and the advancing panzers were engaged with bazookas and howitzers. Wave after wave, the Germans advanced on the 101st from different directions, but time and time again, the paratroopers and glider infantry fought them off in a series of vicious battles through woods and villages. Specialized tree buster shells were soon falling on the German positions, savaging the attackers with splinters and shrapnel. Christmas attack was an absolute disaster for the Germans, with heavy casualties and the loss of a lot of tanks. The siege continued, but the major threat had been fought off. By the 26th, the reserves from Patton's Third Army finally established a corridor into Bastogne, though it would take several more days to secure it since the Germans were trying to cut it off. Skirmishes continued, but even newly arrived SS divisions could not establish another siege. By January, fearing that they might lose overall control of the front, German High Command ordered a full retreat, and the overall strategic initiative in the West shifted to the Americans. By now, the U.S. Air Force was flying attacks again, and on January 12th, when the news of a Soviet winter offensive broke, so too did Hitler's last gamble in the West.
So I said this before when I watched the music video, and I'll say it again. If you really want to get a sense of what this was like for the 101st Airborne Division, there are a couple of episodes of Band of Brothers that are specifically dedicated to Bastogne. In fact, one of the episodes is called Bastogne. And you can see this really was, from having read the books written by several of the members of Easy Company of the 506th, which was part of the 101st Airborne Division, they all pretty much agree that the low point of the war for them was Bastogne. Even though you would think, man, that's something to be proud of what they did. And they are. They're very proud of what they did. But for them personally, it was a low point. It was a low point physically because of the toll that took, the shelling that they underwent there. Even after they had been kind of connected and they were no longer surrounded once Patton broke through, they had to turn around and go on the offensive then. And it was still brutal because the Germans had the trees where they were, the Bois Jacques it was called, zeroed in with artillery, and it was just a brutal time for them. So just because Bastogne was liberated, so to speak, does not mean that things were suddenly better for the Americans. It was a rough couple of months there in December and January, but I highly recommend that you learn more about it. Watch Band of Brothers if you've never seen it. Let's use the comment section below to continue this conversation about Bastogne, about the Battle of the Bulge, as it is called. It's called the Battle of the Bulge because of that bulge that happened in the American lines from the German offensive. And, a lot of people, a lot of veterans that you talk to, there are not many left, but when they were around in a lot greater numbers, that was one of the ones that a lot of them would talk about was their time in the Battle of the Bulge. I know that was my uncle's most experience in terms of combat. So let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. Drop a like if you would. Make sure you subscribe if you haven't already. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.